I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey. Hello there, folks. We are going to be dipping into a very complicated topic today. And props to anybody who caught the reference that I used in the opening gag. And even those of you who didn't, don't worry. I'll actually be circling back onto the film that was pulled from at a later point in the video. So stick around, find out what it was, if you didn't already know. Today, we're going to talk about consent, specifically depictions of consent in popular media. More specifically, the dearth and lack of depictions of consent in mainstream media. This is a difficult topic for a lot of reasons. It obviously, by necessity, is going to dip into some areas that may make some people uncomfortable to talk about. I'm going to try and avoid talking about them in such a way that would be outright triggering, but if the topic in general of consent or a lack of consent is concerning to you, it's okay to skip this video. But before you make the decision to do that, I want to be clear on what I'm talking about here. I'm not going to be going through various instances in various films or TV or whatever where something that is flat out sexual assault is treated as not a big deal. That's the kind of thing you find in a lot of 80s movies. Don't ever rewatch Revenge of the Nerds if you ever did, and if you haven't seen it, don't. But we're not talking about that kind of thing. We're not talking about a case of something that was clearly not okay but was treated as okay. Instead, I want to deal with just the fact that consent at all, like just pausing before the start of engaging in things and going, hey, are you okay with this? Is it okay if we take it to this step? Just doesn't happen. Now, I am going to be talking about some of the more gray area instances, but the actual worst examples we're largely not going to be touching here, except just to acknowledge that, yeah, that's how badly it can go. But that's not where I'm dwelling for this. So by and large, this is more about the lack of addressing consent, and this is by necessity going to become also a bigger discussion of the fact that consent is an odd thing in the current discourse, because it's something that should be very standard and should be deeply uncontroversial to attain consent. However, it's something that gets a lot of pushback from people who either don't think very hard about why they're pushing back on it or know exactly why they're pushing back on it. You get people who slam the idea of asking for consent. You get everything from, well, it's not romantic, it kills the mood, to this general idea of, well, I don't know what is or isn't okay anymore. Well, you know how you'd know? If you asked for consent. But I'm dealing more with that first issue where people are like, well, it's unromantic, it breaks the mood. How is that, like, sexy? And that's an issue that we can kind of lay on the feet of popular culture. Because in popular culture, we haven't really done a good job in depicting consent as a normal part of intimate relations with people. Most films and movies just don't show it. Sometimes you can headcanon that there was a consent conversation that was had because there's often a time jump ahead, from the first kiss to they're getting in the bed. You could headcanon that a consent conversation happened, but it doesn't get shown almost ever. And that's kind of part of the problem. Not the only part of the problem, but part of the problem. Because since we've left it out of our popular culture, we think of it as an intrusion onto something romantic. And since so much of our perception of romance is shaped, yes, by our immediate surroundings and the people around us, but also by the pop culture that we absorb, the fact that it's not there does not help. And it makes things worse. Now, in terms of how things got the way they are, it's worth indulging at least a little bit in the historical perspective, which is that you go back to films from the golden age of Hollywood, and part of the reason you wouldn't get discussions of consent is to properly handle consent often means properly acknowledging sex, because it was one thing back in the day of, say, the Hays Code for the hero and the heroine to kiss, and then you'd pan the camera over to some wind blowing the curtains and you imply what's going on. But when they actually pause and stop and talk about it, well, you're not implying anymore. You're saying it outright. And now you're catching the ire of people who don't want you to talk about it. So that's part of how things kind of initially were off on the wrong foot from the early point of these things. And there are more than enough classic movies you can see where you dip into, let's go with a little bit of a divergence into the topic of dubious consent. So this, in terms of like films, would be where a male character is initially clearly the sexual aggressor in a scene. A modern instance from a film that I love, but this scene is a problem, is the film Blade Runner, where you have our lead hero stop the female love interest from leaving and push her back and not quite force himself on her, but pretty close. Now, she does eventually say, "Kiss me," but that's only after he prompted her to do so.
Say, kiss me. Kiss me.
So I don't want to dig too much into the scene and to why it's problematic, but it is illustrative in that it starts this way, but then every time we see them together subsequent, it seems to be genuine and affectionate. So this is the kind of thing that you actually would get a fair amount in terms of dealing with manly men, dominant men. And the issue of dominant men controlling women, that goes way back before Hollywood. You can go back to Shakespeare and see some issues with that, with things like Taming of the Shrew, which is a fantastic play right up until the very end when suddenly it very much is not.
Come and place your hands below your husband's foot, in token of which duty, if he please, my hand is ready.
But it's worth diverging at least briefly on the general topic of dubious consent, or what is termed in kink circles as consensual non-consent. Just because I want to be clear that these are kind of separate things from what we're talking about, but I also want to explain them because I've seen a lot of bleed over and misunderstanding. So consensual non-consent is actually something that I've seen depicted incredibly rarely in film and television, but is an actual real-life practice. So part of the reason I want to talk about this is because it is worth acknowledging that for some people, a more dubious consent is actually enticing. Not just as a matter of it's what you're used to, you actually take enjoyment from it. In a consensual non-consent scene, you will have the two people participating in it, and the scene itself will play out as if one of them is not consenting to what's going on. But the important thing in those scenes, and that's the term in kink circles for when two people engage in a role play or other kinds of activities like that. So don't be confused when I say scene, because we're also going to be talking about movie scenes later. But anyways, prior to the start of that scene, the two of them have very thoroughly consented to entering into a scene that will play as if there is no consent. And also, properly done, there is always a safe word and the scene can be ended at any point by either person involved. That's not something you see depicted very much. But again, I think it's worth noting because there is actually an appeal to a lack of consent for some people, and pretending that nobody likes that isn't productive. What's interesting about cases of dubious consent is that I'm not going to say they're necessarily more common in literature. Well, at this point, they might be. I'm not going to say that's the case traditionally because, like I said, plenty of classic Hollywood movies and even some relatively recent ones have issues of a man putting himself kind of aggressively towards a woman who then starts to like it even though she didn't initially. Goldfinger, another classic instance of that. The thing is, I think that's something that if you're going to do it, it works much, much better in print than on film, largely because when you read a book, most things that dip into this are written from the perspective of the female in those scenes. Because basically every dubious consent scene is a aggressive man and a woman who initially you're like, is she okay with this? And then it's clear that she is later on. So in literature, you can get away with it more because these scenes are almost always from the perspective of the woman involved. Not necessarily first person, but like we get her thoughts. And so the author is able to bring the audiences and assure them that she was a little unsure at first, but it can let them know how quickly she has become okay with this. Whereas to take an example that was badly botched, and again, try not to dwell on it too much, Season 4, I believe it was, of Game of Thrones, rather infamous scene between the incestuous siblings, Cersei and Jaime Lannister. I'm not going to get into the full details of the scene, but basically there was a massive debate and a bit of an outcry after the scene aired because it looked like he was proceeding forward when she was saying no. Now, the creators said afterwards that wasn't their intent and they wanted something more ambiguous. And I'm actually, while I don't have a lot of respect for them as writers, I don't think they're very good, especially with how that show ended. But I do think they're being honest about that. I think they thought they were doing something a bit gray area. But the thing is, we don't know her thoughts. We don't know at what point, if at any, she became okay with this. Whereas in print, it would be possible for the audience to know that much, much, much sooner. And so that it takes not the entire curse off it, because again, people will have their own levels that they're okay with dealing with dubious consent. But at the very least, it has the potential to reassure audiences way earlier. Whereas when we don't have access to the thoughts of the characters, well, we don't know. And part of the other reason I wanted to bring up dubious consent is it brings in something that is an easy trap for any creator, writer, director, etc., to fall into. Which is that if the writer already knows that the person who initially doesn't appear to be consenting is ultimately going to be okay with it, it becomes easy to forget. The audience doesn't know that in advance. So it's easy for writers to often accidentally overlook the fact that consent is not being properly handled. And understand, consent is not simply asking, are you okay if we do this? It's also about being informed. This is something that the 50 Shades of Grey books and movies are terrible at, because Christian is frequently setting up scenarios and bringing out toys and not properly explaining their use to Anastasia before implementing them. If those conversations happen at all, we are not privy to them. And so there is a lack of informed consent. Even if she says yes, she's doing it on blind faith, which that's not properly informed consent. But it happens anyways because the original author and then the filmmakers already know she's going to be into it once it starts. So it becomes easy to think, oh, it's okay that she's not properly informed because she's going to like it anyway. But you only know that on a meta level as the writer or as a viewer on a rewatch. The actual facts of the scene simply fail to deal with proper informed consent of what's about to happen. And that is kind of a problem. Again, I don't want to overshame the notion of the lack of consent, and I certainly don't want to shame anyone who is into issues of or scenes of dubious consent or consensual non-consent. Let me be very clear about that. However, these things do get intertwined and intermixed, and the way that some of these things get addressed or don't get addressed, that is a bit more acceptable in certain media or certain genres, certain conventions, the general lack of acknowledgement of consent, I just don't think is healthy. I think consent should be the standard. It should be the default in any given scene, that the characters both establish what it is that they are and are not okay with going forward. That should be the standard, not the exception. And the dubious consent or the non-consent scenes, those should be the exception. I'm not saying we can't have them, but they shouldn't be the norm. Could you grant me that at least? Now, there's some general tropes and things that tend to play into and lead to a lack of consent. And some of these things, I think, hopefully, people are starting to realize aren't the best in the world. I mentioned dominant men already. The idea that a man has to take a woman, control a woman. And again, while I'm not going to say that's never okay to depict, it has been the default for a very, very, very long time. And it hasn't gotten much better. And the pace at which it has been real slow. Another aspect of that is the whole notion of a woman playing hard to get.
All right, I'm sorry, though. I'm going to the game with somebody else.
Not anymore. Besides, what, you think you left your purse at my place by accident? No, subconsciously you are dying to take me to that game.
I haven't seen this general idea challenged as broadly as I would like it to. Because while I'm not going to say that there is no such thing as playing hard to get, and that nobody ever does it, because that would be foolish of me to claim, its prominence as a depiction to the phrase that just me saying playing hard to get, you know what that phrase means. Maybe it shouldn't be that ubiquitous. Because if you were to not only watch a movie, but extrapolate things you've seen into a movie into your real life understanding of social cues, because I'm not saying that people behave exactly like they see in movies, but things that are normalized in movies generally tend to become normalized in reality as well. So, can you really distinctly tell the difference between a person who is not interested or who's just playing hard to get? And again, not to say there is no such thing as playing hard to get, but since consent is not standard in depiction, there isn't really a lot of difference until it gets pushed so far that, I don't know, she throws her drink in his face. And even then, depending on the genre, about half the time, they're going to end up getting together anyways, which is another aspect, I suppose, the hostility to lovers thing. Now, in more extreme cases, you get like enemies to lovers, like in anime. And I feel like those sorts of situations are often heightened enough by bizarre circumstances, fantasy scenarios, etc., that I'm not going to dwell on that too much. However, in rom-coms set in the real world, ostensibly showing real people, the degree to which outright hostility to eventual lovers is standard operating procedure, I find that worrying. And I get why it's there. If you're having a romance story and you eventually intend for these two to get together, well, you can't just start they're instantly into each other. Well, you can, but then usually you have to introduce a massive logistical hurdle a la Romeo and Juliet or something else of that nature. But if you're not going to introduce a massive logistical hurdle and you want the story to instead be about the way these two come to care about each other, well, the easiest way to have an arc of the relationship is to have them initially not liking each other and then eventually liking each other. So conceptually, on paper, I get it, but it's been taken to an extreme in a lot of cases. It's not just a matter of, I don't click with that person. It's frighteningly common in romances, especially romantic comedies, for the two people who will eventually end up together to hate each other. And again, this idea of, well, yeah, they don't like me, but they will eventually. And again, I think the ramping up of how severe that initial hatred can be sometimes is a trap that writers fall into because they know they're going to end up together by the end anyway. So, I mean, like, what's it matter how much they hate each other at the start? Well, when you're hammering home the idea over and over and over again that initial rejection,
I want you. I need you. Oh, baby. Oh, baby.
or dislike,
If I really knew you, I know what I would find. Instead of a brain, a cash register. Instead of a heart, a bottom line.
or even hatred
You stand alone on the most arrogant, self-centered son.
does not actually preclude these people from getting together.
I hate you.
Are you as turned on as I am?
More.
What are the takeaway messages for people taking in this entertainment? What behavior are you normalizing when a rejection is not taken as a reason to stop, where hostility is not taken as a reason to not eventually end up as sexual partners? That, again, I find a bit concerning. And like I said, this stuff is all over the place. It's in some of my favorite movies. I mentioned Blade Runner, and if you remember the movie that I referenced at the very start, Rocky Horror Picture Show, which I love. Like, that movie means so much to me. I did a whole video on why that movie means so much to me and so much to so many people. However, it absolutely has multiple scenes of the character of Frank basically forcing himself onto people until they like it. And the character of Rocky exists at all to be Frank's plaything and has no say in the matter. Now, arguably, Frank's actually the villain of the film, so you can make an argument that it's not necessarily glorifying that, but there also isn't much in the way of counterbalancing in terms of saying, well, he's the bad guy, here's how the good guys do it, especially with the impact this has on Brad and Janet. So, seeing this so prevalent and rooted in, again, media that I love and am not going to stop watching, but I also know people who I would not recommend these movies to, or who have told me that they hate these movies because of this kind of material. And I don't blame them one single bit. But to something that I mentioned earlier, the idea that, look, we can't stop and ask for permission at all these stages. Like, consent isn't sexy. Consent breaks up the flow. Are you sure about that? Because first of all, you say that for a movie. If you can't even handle 30 seconds to address consent in a movie, how are you dealing with it in real life? So there's that. And let's also keep in mind that historically, you go back far enough, there used to be a time where guys would argue that putting on a condom wasn't romantic and interrupted the flow, which is actually also something that movies are really, really bad about depicting. Safe sex. They almost never take the time to make it clear when a condom or any other safe sex product or device is being used. And generally, as I said before, jump from the kiss to them in bed. We have no idea. You could headcanon they're having protected sex, but they won't show it. I'm not going to go too far off the rails on that because, honestly, it's kind of the same deal as it is with consent. They could normalize it. It could just be just a simple thing of reaching for the condom. That's all it would really take. And most movies don't do it. Here's the thing. I debated, how many examples do I want to give of movies, TV, etc., that have done consent well? And I think increasingly you're seeing it better done, but it's often a bit like the video I did last week talking about representation. It's a bit more relegated to niche media. In things aimed at a smaller, more targeted audience, you will see this start to come up more, and more often in either movies made for streaming services or series that aren't necessarily being viewed by the masses, by the mainstream. And I could cite you a ton of those examples, but most people probably wouldn't know them. And I'd have to show clips, I'd risk copyright, all this stuff. But you know what? I don't have to reference small, independent, niche, micro-targeted media for an excellent example of consent. I can cite one of the highest grossing, most viewed, most awarded films ever made. My friends, let's talk about consent in the film Titanic. Yeah, Titanic. James Cameron, Leonardo DiCaprio, Kate Winslet, that Titanic. Because it handles consent really, really well. So there's two primary scenes that I want to draw attention to. One is the scene where Jack draws Rose. The other is what happens when they're in the car. So, in both cases, they're already counterbalancing the typical narrative of the man initiating everything. Because women initiating things, women being the more dominant in a sexual scene, is usually reserved for femme fatales, villainesses, women that the movie is otherwise judging as being loose and easy. That's not the case here. Every step that these two move towards physical intimacy is initiated by Rose.
Jack, I want you to draw me like one of your French girls. Wearing this.
It is her idea for him to draw her.
Wearing only this.
It is her idea for him to draw her naked. She does know that he draws people naked, that this is not something outside of his usual comfort zone. And she does give him the heads up, saying, I want you to draw me in this.
Wearing only this.
She doesn't shock him. She doesn't come out in the robe and suddenly she's naked and he didn't expect that. He knew it was going to happen. He's still a little surprised because it's Kate Winslet in the late 90s. She's gorgeous, but he knew. He knew, and he had set up, and he was ready to draw her knowing she was not going to be clothed. She proposed it. He agreed to it. That's the first thing. Then we have their actual sex scene in the car. And again, initiated by her. She pulls him back into the back seat. Jack, honestly, he's a bit of a soft boy in this. And she stops before things start really going, and she says to him,
Put your hands on me, Jack.
She says what she wants and waits for him to acknowledge he is also okay with that by moving forward. All of this is integrated into the flow of conversation, of interaction. It never feels like it stops the scene. It's baked into the scene. And it's best known as a romance. So don't ever try to tell me that asking for consent isn't sexy. Because Jack and Rose would like a word. And honestly, that's what I want to see more of. I don't need you to literally stop the scene dead for them to sit down and negotiate what they are and aren't going to do. And the fact that people, so many, think that's what consent would look like in order to have it in films shows how much more we need to depict it. Because I've just given you an example where it is seamlessly integrated to the point that I bet a whole bunch of you didn't even realize that consent was a core part of those scenes. This is what we need. It's not that hard. It's not that jarring. It doesn't have to be. There's no reason for it to be. And there are other examples of consent handled very well out there. Thelma and Louise has a great scene when it comes to that. Frozen, towards the very end.
I could kiss you.
I could. I mean, I'd like to. May I? Me? I mean, may we? Wait, what?
We may.
In children's media, there's another great metaphorical example in Steven Universe with Stevonnie. The very first time that Connie and Steven fuse into that character, they are continually checking in with each other.
Are you okay? We can stop if you... No.
And that's not even an actual sex scene. It's just a metaphorical analogy for a really close relationship, but they're still checking in continually. It's not that hard. We're just not doing it. Could we start? Please? What are some of your favorite depictions of consent in any media? Film, book, TV show, video game? Because I know my friend Jesse Gender likes to bring up Psychonauts 2 in regards to consent. Because a big part of that game is characters jumping into another character's mind. And in that particular game, they ask for permission before they do it.
Would you mind if I went inside your mind and sorted a few things out?
I'm never opposed to anything getting properly sorted.
So consent can take all kinds of forms. What are some of your favorite depictions? Where do you think it was done best? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Like, share, subscribe. They all help me out. If you really want to help me out, Patreon is what enables me to do this as my living and have these videos out on a regular basis at the, hopefully, quality that I'm able to do them. Any amount you can provide is of great assistance, but even if you can't, it's okay. Because what I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. Hey, end credits time, which means I need to shout out some patrons. This time I'm going to be shouting out Robin Moore, Zubin Litfala, Tarak, Oliver B., Melinda Walters, Imudelki, Leo the Boy, TT, Vernobulax the Poodle, Zach Paul, Eidolon, Tracy Scrabbit, Vincent Paul Bartolucci, Angry Kasparov, Toku BL Hoovian, Adam RDL Taylor, Shane Ross, Shayla Gourlay, and Brendan LaRose. You want to hear me mispronounce your name? Check out rewards on the Patreon. Thanks for all your support.